Memphis, summer 1956. In a sweltering school auditorium, the local judge pounds his fist on the table. His voice cuts through the thick air. Elvis Presley is a disgrace to America. His movements are indecent, his songs a threat to our youth. Parents gasp, some nodding in agreement, others whispering nervously. By dawn, newspapers carry the headline nationwide. Judge brands Presley a national disgrace. In the smoky cafes of Memphis, men fold their papers with grim satisfaction. In small-town kitchens, mothers shake their heads in fear. On the radio, DJs argue whether to ban his records. For a nation still clinging to post-war morality, the judgment is clear. Elvis Presley is no longer just a singer. He is the accused, put on trial before America itself. And as the storm builds, one question hangs in the air like a thundercloud. Will the boy from Tupelo be buried under condemnation? Or will he rise from disgrace to redefine the very soul of American music? Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The summer of 1956 carried a strange electricity across America. Radio stations spun his records until the vinyl nearly burned. Department stores couldn't keep his singles in stock, and teenage girls pasted his photograph on bedroom walls as if he were a prophet of some new gospel. Yet for every cheer that followed Elvis Presley, another corner of the nation shuddered. Pastors thundered against him from pulpits. School boards debated whether to ban his music from dances, and parents wrote letters in angry ink, demanding that this boy with the hips be kept away from their children. The war had ended little more than a decade earlier, and America was still shaping its post-war identity. For many, the sight of a 21-year-old from Tupelo, Mississippi, shaking on stage to the rhythm of Hound Dog was not liberation, it was corrosion. Newspapers began to run stern columns, warning that Presley was a symptom of a culture in decline. And then came the sharpest blow. A judge, speaking before a gathering of concerned parents and educators, declared that Elvis Presley was not merely inappropriate entertainment, but a disgrace to America itself. The words traveled faster than the echo of a guitar chord. They appeared on front pages from Memphis to New York. "Disgrace to America," the headlines blared. For a young man barely past his 21st birthday, it felt less like criticism and more like a public sentencing. That night, after a blistering performance in Dallas, Elvis sat alone in his dressing room. The cheers from the arena had long since faded into silence. His hair, still damp from sweat and pomade, clung to his forehead as he unrolled the evening paper. There, in block letters, were the judge's words. He gripped the edges so tightly that the paper tore. His hands trembled, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper, a sting that no amount of applause could soften. A knock at the door broke the silence. His manager peeked in, eyes darting nervously. "You might want to brace yourself," he said, laying another stack of clippings on the vanity. Each one echoed the same condemnation. Judges, officials, even ministers, branding him as vulgar, indecent, dangerous. Elvis nodded quietly, but the hollow look in his eyes betrayed the storm inside. Then the phone rang. On the other end was his mother, Gladys. Her voice was quivering, heavy with worry. "Son," she whispered through the crackle of the line, "they're saying things, ugly things. I don't understand why they hate you so much. I'm afraid, what if they stop you from being on television?" Elvis listened in silence, his chest tightening. He could picture her sitting at the kitchen table back in Memphis, wringing her hands, tears welling up in her eyes. For him, success had always meant pride for his family, not fear. To hear his mother's voice weighted with dread cut him deeper than the judge's proclamation. When the call ended, his producer entered with a look that said the news wouldn't improve. "Elvis," he began, "we've just received word. The television network is reconsidering. There's talk that if this backlash doesn't cool down, they might pull your appearance. They don't want sponsors to panic. I'm telling you, this could cost us everything." The words landed like lead. Elvis leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. To him, music wasn't scandal. It was the language he'd carried since boyhood, from the gospel choirs of Memphis churches to the rhythm and blues joints on Beale Street. And now it was being twisted into evidence against him, as though a backbeat could corrupt the nation's soul. Later that night, as the crew packed up equipment, a small envelope arrived among the fan mail. It bore no return address, just a hurried scrawl. Inside was a letter, written in the shaky handwriting of a young fan. "They say you are bad for America. They want to take away your music. But to us, you are the only one who understands how it feels to be young, alive, and different. Don't let them silence you. You are our voice." Elvis read the note 3 times, holding it as if it were more fragile than the paper it was written on. For every judge who condemned him, there were thousands who looked to him with hope. He thought of the screaming crowds, of boys slicking their hair back to look like him, of girls who saw in him a spark of freedom. Wasn't that America, too? Still, the fear lingered. The thought of losing the stage, the one place he felt truly alive, gnawed at him. He folded the letter carefully, slid it into his jacket pocket, and whispered almost to himself, "If they want a fight, I'll give them music they can't ignore." Outside, the night stretched across the city, neon buzzing against the dark. Somewhere in the distance, a radio spun his latest single, and a group of teenagers gathered around, singing along in defiance of the very headlines that condemned him. Inside his dressing room, Elvis sat with the letter pressed to his chest, the judge's words still ringing in his ears. And in that silence between applause and condemnation, he understood that his battle was no longer just about music. It was about who he was allowed to be, and whether America was ready to accept him. October 1956 arrived with a chill in the air, but the heat around Elvis Presley was relentless. Every week seemed to bring another editorial, another pastor's sermon, another accusation that his performances were unfit for decent society. The more he shook, the more America trembled, half with joy, half with outrage. And yet, television remained the great battleground. A single broadcast could make or break him, carry him into every living room, or shut him out completely. That's why the invitation from The Ed Sullivan Show meant so much. It was the crown jewel of American variety television, a program that could turn a singer into a national institution overnight. But behind the curtain, the negotiations had been tense. Ed Sullivan himself had once dismissed Presley as a fad unworthy of his stage. Now, pressed by the undeniable ratings power of Elvis's first TV appearances elsewhere, the network relented, but only under strict conditions. The night of the show, the studio hummed with nervous energy. Cameramen checked their angles again and again. Producers whispered into headsets. The air reeked of hot lights, hair pomade, and cigarette smoke curling toward the rafters. In the cramped dressing room, Elvis sat quietly with his guitar across his lap. He strummed a few muted chords, his lips moving in silence, as though rehearsing words only he could hear. "They can cut the frame in half," he told himself, "but they can't cut the music out of me." A knock came at the door. A tall man in a pinstripe suit entered, carrying the stiff authority of a lawyer. "Mr. Presley," he said flatly, "let me be clear. This is a live broadcast. One hint of suggestive movement, One step too far, and the network will pull the plug. Not later. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Do you understand? His tone carried not threat, but certainty, as though the decision had already been made, and Elvis was standing trial again, this time before millions of unseen jurors. Elvis looked up, his blue eyes steady but unreadable. He nodded once, no words, just the quiet acknowledgement of a man weighing the cost of defiance. The lawyer left, leaving behind a silence that clung to the room. Just before Elvis made his way to the stage, he noticed a flash of movement at the studio entrance. A group of fans had managed to sneak in a banner, hastily painted in thick red letters. "Show them what it means to be American." Security tried to block the view, but not before Elvis caught sight of it. He smiled faintly, a spark breaking through his controlled composure. Those words, scrawled in paint, reminded him why he had fought so hard to get here. The stagehand raised his hand. 3, 2, 1. The red light blinked on, and America was watching. The cameras framed him from the waist up, just as ordered. Viewers at home would see only the narrow box of his shoulders, his smile, his restless hands moving across the guitar. But even cropped, his presence filled the screen. He opened with, "Don't be cruel," his voice steady, rich, brimming with the swagger of youth, yet tempered with a new kind of defiance. The audience inside the studio erupted. Girls screamed so loudly that the microphones nearly peaked. Boys leaned forward, eyes wide, studying every move as though to memorize it. Even confined by the frame, Elvis seemed larger than life. His rhythm, his energy, his charisma, none of it could be contained by a camera lens. The decision to cut him off at the waist became, ironically, the very thing that heightened his power. The mystery of what the audience could not see only added to the frenzy. Backstage, Sullivan and the producers exchanged uneasy glances. They had tried to tame him, but instead they had magnified him. Ratings would prove it. When the song ended, Elvis flashed a shy grin, ducked his head as if embarrassed, and thanked the crowd. It was a simple gesture, but it struck viewers as disarming, even wholesome. Mothers who had expected to clutch their pearls found themselves leaning closer to the set. Fathers who had muttered about that wild boy found themselves quietly tapping their feet. By the time the show ended, America was divided, but no longer about whether Elvis mattered. That question was settled. The debate had shifted. Was he dangerous, or was he the most exciting new figure the nation had produced since the war? The following morning, the headlines told the story. Presley draws record viewers. From disgrace to phenomenon. Critics who had once dismissed him as vulgar now grudgingly admitted that his magnetism was undeniable. Sponsors who had hesitated were suddenly begging to attach their names to the rising star. But for Elvis, the triumph was personal. Sitting at a diner booth with his band in the early hours after the show, he held his coffee mug and looked around at the exhausted faces of his friends. "They thought they could hide me," he said softly, almost to himself. "But you can't hide a song. Not when it's meant to be heard." The waitress, overhearing, placed a slice of pie in front of him and whispered, "My little sister was watching. She thinks you're the best thing that's ever happened to music." Elvis blushed, ducked his head again, and muttered thanks. For all the noise around him, the judges, the critics, the cameras, it was moments like that, small and human, that reminded him why he sang. What the nation saw that night was more than a boy in a cropped frame. It was a declaration. Elvis Presley had stood before the country under threat of being silenced, and proved that charisma, honesty, and music could not be cut down by the scissors of censorship. And though the battle with his critics was far from over, America had witnessed something it could not unsee. The aftershocks of Elvis's television triumph rippled across the nation. For weeks, radio stations played his singles without pause, and teenagers debated every word he had sung on Ed Sullivan's stage. He had proven that no camera crop or lawyer's warning could stifle him. Yet the louder the applause grew, the sharper the knives of his critics became. By early 1957, the judge who had once declared him a disgrace resurfaced with renewed venom. At a town hall packed with anxious parents, he thundered from the podium, "We cannot allow America's sons and daughters to bow before a boy from Tupelo who shakes his body like a circus act. This is not culture. This is corruption." The audience, filled with mothers clutching pocketbooks and fathers in stiff collars, nodded along. Newspapers carried his remarks the next morning, ensuring the accusations reached every porch in the country. The attacks no longer startled Elvis, but they stung all the same. In private, he carried the weight of the condemnation heavily. His mother fretted endlessly, his father urged him to be cautious, and his manager schemed about how to keep the scandal from drying up opportunities. Yet the offers kept coming. Concert tours, film contracts, and now invitations from unlikely quarters. One such invitation came sealed with the presidential crest. It wasn't from the president himself, but from a senior aide in Washington. The note was brief. The administration would like to extend an informal meeting with Mr. Presley to discuss the influence of popular music on America's youth. For Elvis, the idea of stepping into the White House felt surreal. He had grown up in a two-room house in Tupelo, too poor for even a decent Christmas tree some years. Now men in suits wanted to hear his thoughts on the very culture he was accused of destroying. The meeting was held in a modest reception room rather than the Oval Office. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and cigar smoke. Elvis wore a dark suit, his hair slicked carefully into place, and though he tried to hide it, his hands fidgeted nervously. Across from him sat two men, advisors, not politicians. Their tone was measured, almost clinical. "Mr. Presley," one began, "there are voices in the public square saying your music encourages rebellion, that it feeds impulses the nation can't afford to encourage. What do you say to that?" Elvis cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "Sir, I don't believe music makes people bad. Music has been the only thing that's kept me good. When I was a boy and felt like nothing, it was gospel songs that gave me hope. It was the blues that told me I wasn't alone. If a song can take away someone's loneliness, how can that be wrong?" The second advisor leaned forward, eyes narrowing, as if weighing every syllable. Finally, he allowed the faintest of smiles. "Between us, son, you might be the best chance we've got to show the world an America that's not afraid of its own youth. Don't squander that." The conversation ended there, without promises, without ceremony. But as Elvis walked back into the crisp Washington air, he carried with him something he hadn't expected, the sense that even within the walls of power, there were men who believed in him. The press, however, twisted the encounter into fresh scandal. Headlines mocked, "Presley in the White House? What next? Rock and roll cabinet meetings?" Columnists sneered that it was proof the country was losing its mind. Once again, the judge seized the moment, declaring, "When the leaders of this country embrace indecency, it tells us how far we have fallen." His words circulated widely, feeding the firestorm. But history is full of ironies, and even as scorn mounted, recognition followed. Later that spring, Elvis received an unexpected honor from the U.S. Army, a framed commendation thanking him for his fundraising performances that supported military charities. The award was modest in appearance, but the symbolism was undeniable. The very institution that embodied duty and discipline was acknowledging the boy the judge had branded a disgrace. Elvis accepted the honor humbly, without fanfare. "I'm just proud to do my part," he told reporters, his eyes downcast, his tone almost apologetic. Yet the moment did not go unnoticed. Newspapers that had once ridiculed him as a passing fad began to soften. "Perhaps," one editorial admitted, "this young man is not as shallow as we once believed." Back in Memphis, Elvis kept the plaque on a shelf where his mother could see it. He didn't talk about it much, but when he caught her looking at it, smiling proudly, he felt something no chart position or screaming crowd could equal. The paradox of his life deepened. Condemned from pulpits, praised by soldiers, mocked in editorials, worshipped by millions of fans. Elvis was caught in the tug-of-war of a nation unsure whether to crown him or crucify him. And yet, in his quietest moments, when he sat at the piano late at night and let his fingers find an old gospel tune, he knew the truth. Music was not scandal. It was salvation. The world simply hadn't caught up yet. By 1958, the whirlwind of Elvis Presley's rise had reached a strange pause. His records still sold by the millions, his concerts filled arenas, and yet the headlines had shifted. America was buzzing with news of his draft notice. The boy who had shaken the stage was now expected to wear the uniform of his country. Some critics predicted he would wriggle free with favors and privileges. Others, like the judge who had long branded him a menace, sharpened their words again. "Perhaps the army will make a man of him. Or perhaps it will expose him for what he truly is, an entertainer who cannot survive outside the spotlight." Elvis heard the remarks, but said nothing publicly. Privately, though, he made a choice that startled even those close to him. Offered the chance to serve in a cushy promotional role, something that would keep him in comfort while boosting recruitment numbers, he refused. "If I'm going to serve," he told his father Vernon, "I'll do it the way any other man would." And so, instead of Hollywood sets or luxury barracks, Elvis found himself in a regular unit. The barracks smelled of sweat, starch, and damp wool. The metal bed frames creaked at night, and the mess hall food was a far cry from the feasts fans imagined their idol enjoying. Yet Elvis took to it with a kind of quiet determination. He rose at dawn, folded his sheets tight, polished his boots until they gleamed, and marched under the same sun as the other boys. At first, his presence unsettled the platoon. Some expected a prima donna, a star too fragile to rough it in the mud. But slowly, doubts faded. He cracked jokes during long drills, carried his share of the weight on marches, and even gave up his seat one night so a homesick private could write a letter in peace. When lights went out, Elvis would sometimes pull out his guitar and play softly, his voice low and warm in the darkness. Old gospel tunes, blues standards, even a few of his own hits, sung not with swagger, but with tenderness. The men listened, heads resting on pillows, and for a few minutes the barracks became a home rather than a holding pen for boys headed toward manhood. Letters from those soldiers began to circulate. "He's not what you think," one wrote to his parents. "He eats the same food, scrubs the same floors, sings like an angel when the lights go out. Elvis Presley isn't playing soldier. He is one of us." Meanwhile, the judge doubled down. At a local civic event, he reminded reporters, "The Army is not a stage. If Presley thinks he can charm his way through service the way he charms crowds, he is mistaken. The uniform demands discipline, not gyrations." His words splashed across newspapers once again, fueling the never-ending tug-of-war over Elvis's image. Then tragedy struck. In August of 1958, while stationed in Germany, Elvis received news that his mother, Gladys, had fallen gravely ill. He rushed home, only to arrive in Memphis just hours before she passed away. The grief was unlike anything he had ever known. At the funeral, reporters gathered at a distance, their lenses capturing an image the world had rarely seen. Elvis Presley, the indestructible showman, weeping openly, shoulders hunched, inconsolable at the loss of the woman who had been his anchor. For once, even the harshest critics softened. Newspapers that had long painted him as a cultural threat now ran headlines like "Presley grieves, just like any son." Photographs of him clutching his father's arm, face streaked with tears, circulated nationwide. Fans sent thousands of condolence letters. Soldiers in his unit pledged to look after him when he returned. Back in Germany, Elvis buried himself in routine. He worked hard, kept to himself, and avoided the temptations that might have derailed him. There were nights when loneliness nearly crushed him, when he sat alone in his room staring at his mother's photograph. But he also knew the world was watching, and so he pushed forward, determined to prove that he was more than the caricature the judge had painted. The paradox deepened. Here was the young man once accused of corrupting America's youth, now serving his country with the same grit as any farm boy drafted from Iowa or Texas. For the first time, even some skeptics admitted that maybe, just maybe, the boy from Tupelo was not a disgrace, but a symbol of a new kind of American story. One forged in poverty, tempered by fame, tested by loss, and hardened in service. Still, the judge refused to bend. In interviews, he clung to his refrain: "Time in uniform does not erase indecency on stage." America must not forget what he represents. But America was already beginning to shift. For every harsh column, there were now twice as many voices praising his humility in the barracks, his humanity at his mother's funeral, his refusal to take shortcuts in service. The once one-sided chorus of condemnation had become a divided debate. And in the middle of it all stood Elvis Presley, grieving son, soldier, and still, despite everything, the king of rock and roll. When Elvis came back from the Army in 1960, America greeted him as though he had returned from a foreign war a hero. Crowds lined streets, flash bulbs burst in his face, and reporters shouted over one another for a quote. In his absence, rock and roll had not died. It had grown, but no one had filled the space he left. His return was the ignition switch fans had been waiting for. Record sales skyrocketed again. Radio stations rotated his singles hourly, and suddenly, Elvis was bigger than before. But with triumph came a new prison. Hollywood had been circling him for years, and now the studios pounced. Executives saw not the soldier who had shared bunks with ordinary boys, not the grieving son who had buried his mother, but a marketable figurehead. They wanted his face on posters, his voice in soundtracks, his name tied to tidy plots churned out by the dozen. At first, it seemed harmless, another way to reach his audience, but slowly the machine closed around him. Day after day, he reported to sound stages instead of concert halls. Instead of screaming crowds, there were camera crews and choreographers, directors barking instructions about smile bigger, move left, sing it softer. The films multiplied, predictable musicals and light comedies where Elvis played soldiers, cowboys, or charming rogues, singing on cue to win the girl. The money was enormous. Studios called it success. Yet inside, Elvis felt the spark dimming. On one set, during a lunch break, he confided to a longtime friend, "I don't feel like I'm singing anymore. I'm posing, like a cardboard cutout with a soundtrack." His voice was low, almost ashamed. The friend tried to reassure him. "People still love you, man. That's what matters." but Elvis's eyes betrayed the emptiness. Meanwhile, the judge who had once condemned him resurfaced in the press. This time, his tone carried a mocking satisfaction. "Now you see? The so-called king is no longer shaking his hips on stage. He's just another Hollywood picture boy. This is not art. It's business. He's been tamed, like a lion in a circus cage." The words cut deeper than before, because they held a sliver of truth Elvis could not deny. The critics began to echo similar sentiments. Reviews of the films grew harsher with each release. Dull. Formulaic. A waste of Presley's talent. Fans still flocked to theaters, but the screaming was quieter now, the energy thinner. The raw danger of 1956 had been replaced by tidy choreography and catchy, forgettable tunes. Inside the studio boardrooms, managers and executives told him it was for the best. Live concerts. That's behind you, Elvis. The kids want movies. The future is film. Stick with the formula. Each word felt like a nail hammered into the coffin of the artist he wanted to be. He still recorded albums, but often they were tied to film contracts, songs written to fill space rather than to ignite passion. At night, alone in his mansion in Memphis, he sat at the piano and played the old gospel hymns his mother had loved. Sometimes he played them until dawn, his voice hoarse, his heart aching. He didn't need cameras, costumes, or scripts then, just the simple sound of music that made him feel alive. It was in those moments he admitted to himself that he was living someone else's dream, not his own. The breaking point came unexpectedly. During the filming of yet another light-hearted picture, the director handed him a scene that required singing to a dog dressed in costume. Elvis went along, but when the cameras cut, he pulled his co-star aside and muttered, "This isn't music. This is a joke." He walked off set early that day, leaving stunned crew members whispering behind his back. Not long after, when a studio pressed him to sign on to another identical project, he shocked his manager. "No," Elvis said firmly, his voice steady in a way it hadn't been in years. "I won't keep selling myself as wallpaper. I'm not a puppet. I came back from the army to sing, not to be a picture in a frame." His manager argued, waving contract numbers and box office figures, but Elvis shook his head. "Money won't matter when the music's gone." Word of his refusal spread quickly. The press seized it as evidence of tension within his empire. Some called it arrogance, others rebellion. But beneath the noise, a quiet anticipation began to build. Fans who had grown weary of the endless film cycle started to whisper. Maybe he was planning something bigger, something that would remind the world who Elvis Presley truly was. The judge, of course, sneered again in a local interview, "It makes no difference. Once you've sold your soul to Hollywood, there's no getting it back." But Elvis knew better. Deep inside, the fire that had nearly been smothered was beginning to glow again. The years in Hollywood had been a cage, yes, but they had also sharpened his hunger to escape it. The boy from Tupelo had not forgotten the feeling of a live stage, the roar of a crowd, the pulse of real music. And soon he would take it back. 1968 arrived with tension, humming through the air like a live wire. The country was in turmoil. Vietnam, assassinations, protests filling the streets. The old certainties of the 1950s had fractured, and the youth that once screamed for Elvis Presley were now restless, searching for new voices. Some said Elvis was finished, his glory years behind him. The movies had drained the danger out of him. The king had become, to many, a relic. But Elvis himself felt the ache more than anyone. He was tired of scripted songs, of Hollywood laughter canned for audiences that wanted more. Inside, he still carried the same restless fire that had once shaken high school gyms and church basements. And when the opportunity came for a television special, he seized it. Not as a film promotion, not as a packaged variety act, but as a chance to reclaim himself. The rehearsals for the NBC special were charged with uncertainty. The network wanted a Christmas program, something family-friendly and harmless. Elvis pushed back. "If I'm going on television," he told the director, Steve Binder, "I'm going as myself. No gimmicks, no costumes, just music." Binder agreed, sensing that something extraordinary could happen if Elvis was given freedom. The night of the taping, Elvis walked into the studio wearing a tight black leather suit. The outfit clung to him like a second skin, shining under the lights. It was bold, raw, almost confrontational. A man stepping out of Hollywood gloss and back into danger. The audience, seated in the round around the stage, gasped when he appeared. Some had not seen him live in years. He was older now, but stronger, sharper, eyes blazing with the determination of a man reclaiming his throne. Just before stepping into the circle of light, a crew member, smirking, whispered, "Remember what they said years ago? That judge calling you a disgrace?" The words hit him like a flashback. For a brief moment, he stood frozen, the echo of that condemnation ringing in his ears. But then he exhaled slowly, squared his shoulders, and strode into the spotlight. He took his seat with his guitar, surrounded by his old bandmates, and without introduction began to strum Heartbreak Hotel. His voice cracked the air, deep and full, carrying every ounce of grit and soul he had gathered through years of fame, grief, and frustration. The crowd erupted. This wasn't the polished Hollywood star. This was the rebel, the boy from Tupelo, resurrected. Song after song followed. Jailhouse Rock, Love Me Tender, One Night. He joked between numbers, laughed, teased the crowd, sweat pouring down his forehead under the hot lights. The camera crew, meant to frame a safe Christmas special, captured instead a living explosion of energy and authenticity. At one point, standing, he rocked his body in that old, unmistakable rhythm, the very movement that judges and preachers had once called obscene. Now, in 1968, it looked not obscene but defiant, triumphant. When the final notes rang out, the studio audience rose to its feet, clapping, shouting, some even crying. The special aired weeks later, and the reaction was seismic. Viewers who had written him off as a relic were glued to their screens. Ratings shattered expectations. Critics who had mocked him as Hollywood's puppet now wrote with awe, "He's back." Stronger than ever, one paper declared, Elvis Presley has been resurrected. For Elvis, the triumph was sweeter than any box office success. He had stepped into the glare of live television again, with all of America watching, and proved not only that he still mattered, but that he could command the stage like no one else alive. He wasn't the fading idol of the early 60s. He was alive, dangerous, undeniable. But not everyone celebrated. The judge, now older but still eager for attention, was asked in an interview what he thought of the comeback. He paused, then said with a sneer, "I saw the performance. It changes nothing. America deserves better than a leather-clad spectacle." His words, printed in black ink the next morning, hung like a stubborn shadow over the victory. Elvis didn't respond publicly, but in private, he told his band, "He can say what he wants. I know what I felt up there tonight." And so does every soul who was watching. His voice was calm, not angry. The battle with the judge no longer consumed him. It fueled him. That night, when the cameras turned off and the studio emptied, Elvis lingered on stage alone for a moment. He touched the microphone, still warm from his hand, and looked around at the empty chairs where fans had screamed hours earlier. He whispered under his breath, almost as a prayer, "I'm back." And he was. The comeback special had lit the fuse again. The king was not dead. He had been reborn in black leather, under the heat of television lights, defying every doubt and every accusation. The fight with his critics would continue, but from this moment forward, Elvis was no longer the boy who could be tamed by Hollywood or silenced by judges. He was once again the force that shook America to its core. By the summer of 1969, Elvis Presley stood at a crossroads once again. The '68 comeback special had reignited his fire, but the question remained, could he turn a single television triumph into a lasting rebirth? His answer came in the form of a neon-lit desert city that had become America's playground. Las Vegas. The International Hotel had just been built, an opulent fortress of glass and marble boasting the largest showroom in the world. The management wanted a headliner who could match the scale of the space. Elvis signed on for an extended engagement, a gamble that would either secure his place as a living legend or expose him as a relic grasping at relevance. Opening night, the room pulsed with anticipation. The audience was a mix of high-rolling gamblers, movie stars, critics, and ordinary fans who had driven across states just to witness history. Behind the curtain, Elvis adjusted his high-collared cape, beads of sweat already forming along his temples. He turned to his band, grinning but tense. "Let's show them we're not just a memory," he said, his voice steady, his eyes burning. The orchestra struck, the lights blazed, and Elvis stormed the stage. For 90 minutes, he commanded the room with a blend of raw power and polished showmanship. He sang old hits, gospel medleys, soaring ballads, his voice filling the cavernous hall like thunder. The crowd erupted after every number, some rising to their feet, others weeping openly. Critics scribbled furiously in their notebooks, realizing they were witnessing something more than nostalgia. It was resurrection. Yet behind the glitter, there was strain. Backstage, after one performance, Elvis peeled off his sweat-soaked jumpsuit, tossing it onto a chair. Breathing hard, he looked at his band. "They want a cartoon," he muttered. "They want me to sparkle and spin until I look like a jukebox with legs. But the songs, they're still mine. That's what keeps me alive." Not everyone agreed. The same judge who had haunted his career since 1956 resurfaced in the press. In a newspaper interview, he dismissed the Vegas triumph. "This is no art. This is a carnival show for tourists." Once again, Presley proves he is more spectacle than substance. His words carried a sting precisely because the neon glamour of Vegas blurred the line between artistry and entertainment. Elvis, however, refused to be defined by critics. One night, midway through a packed show, he spotted a woman in the front rows clutching a photograph of her son, a young soldier killed in Vietnam. Her eyes were red, her body trembling as she held the picture against her chest. Without hesitation, Elvis stopped the band. The room fell silent. He walked to the edge of the stage, pointed to the woman, and said gently, "This one's for you." Then he began "Bridge Over Troubled Water," his voice cracking with emotion. By the final note, the woman was sobbing, and so was half the audience. The newspapers couldn't ignore it. "Presley brings Vegas to tears," one headline read. The story of the dedication spread across the country, reshaping even skeptical hearts. For all the rhinestones and capes, it was moments like that which revealed the man behind the myth. Still, the judge clung to his crusade. He announced he was preparing a public lecture on the moral decay fueled by Presley's influence. To him, Elvis was not a grieving son singing for a soldier's mother, but a symbol of everything wrong with American youth. His threats of another campaign against Presley created a ripple of unease, an old wound torn open just as Elvis was finding his footing again. In private, Elvis responded not with anger, but with resolve. "They've called me a disgrace for more than 10 years, he told his close circle one night after a show. "If they think I'll bow out now, they're wrong. I'll keep singing until the songs drown them out." Vegas became his proving ground. Night after night, he took the stage, pouring himself into each performance, refusing to let the city reduce him to a glittering attraction. For the fans, it worked. For the critics, it complicated the narrative. And for the judge, it only deepened the frustration of a man who had spent years trying to silence a voice that would not quit. The clash was far from over. But, as the curtain fell on another sold-out night at the International, Elvis stood tall, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, eyes bright with the fire of survival. He had reclaimed his crown, not through scandal, not through controversy, but through the undeniable power of song. The early 1970s were a time of turbulence across America. Protests filled the streets, the war in Vietnam tore families apart, and distrust in government climbed with each passing month. In the midst of this upheaval, Elvis Presley, once dismissed as a scandalous fad, was suddenly being invited into the very halls of power. In December 1970, dressed in a purple velvet suit and a gold belt buckle as wide as his fist, Elvis walked through the gates of the White House. His visit had not been announced to the public. He had simply written a letter, offering to help the country fight what he saw as its greatest enemy: drugs. He had asked for one thing in return: a badge from the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. To outsiders, the request sounded eccentric, but for Elvis, it was deeply serious. He believed that with that badge, he could position himself as an ally of law enforcement, a figure young people might respect enough to listen to. He wanted to use his influence not to corrupt, but to protect. Inside the Oval Office, President Richard Nixon shook his hand, somewhat bewildered by the spectacle of the king of rock and roll standing in front of him. Elvis spoke with passion, his voice urgent, his words tumbling out faster than expected. "Mr. President, I want to help. The young people, they listen to me. I can reach them. I can show them there's another way besides drugs." Nixon, cautious but intrigued, agreed. Before the meeting ended, an agent presented Elvis with the coveted badge. A photograph captured the moment: the president and the king standing side by side, two unlikely figures bound by a strange, fleeting alliance. When the news broke, reactions split sharply. To some, Elvis had become the ultimate American patriot, the poor boy from Mississippi, now advising the president on matters of national concern. To others, it was absurd theater. One columnist mocked, "A rock star collecting law enforcement trinkets. What's next? Presley leading cabinet meetings?" And then, inevitably, the judge re-emerged, his voice sharp as ever. In an interview, he sneered, "An American symbol? Hardly. What kind of country makes a clown in rhinestones its representative? Presley begging for badges is not patriotism, it is parody." His words reignited the old debate. Was Elvis Presley the embodiment of American spirit, or the very image of its decline? Elvis heard the criticism but pressed forward. He began a series of benefit concerts for veterans returning from Vietnam, donating proceeds to organizations that cared for wounded soldiers and grieving families. He shook hands with veterans backstage, listened to their stories, signed autographs for their children. Many of those men and women, scarred by war and forgotten by much of the country, found in Elvis not a spectacle, but a comrade. someone who saw them, honored them, and gave them a moment of dignity. The press didn't quite know what to do with this contradiction. One week, they ran photos of Elvis in dazzling jumpsuits, drenched in sweat on a Vegas stage, criticized for excess. The next, they ran stories of him handing out checks to veterans' charities, praised for generosity. The duality of his life baffled them. Sinner and saint, clown and patriot, disgrace and hero. Meanwhile, his fans organized petitions, sending stacks of signatures to newspapers and television stations, demanding that Elvis's cultural contributions be recognized officially. They called him a national treasure, a voice of hope, a man who had lifted spirits during dark times. He sings for the ordinary people, one petition read. That is America. In private, Elvis wrestled with the contradictions. One evening, sitting with friends in his Memphis home, he held the badge Nixon had given him and stared at it for a long time. "They don't understand," he said quietly. "They see rhinestones, sideburns, and jumpsuits. They don't see the heart. They don't see that I'm trying to save lives, not ruin them." His words carried no anger, only fatigue, and a longing to be seen for what he truly was. The divide between his image and his intent grew wider with each passing month. To millions of fans, Elvis had become the living embodiment of the American dream. Poor boy makes good. Soldier serves honorably. Singer conquers the world. To his critics, he was still the boy from Tupelo, who had never grown beyond the shaking hips of 1956. The tension built toward another inevitable clash. Elvis could not remain both saint and scandal in the eyes of the public. At some point, he would have to answer the question once and for all. Was he America's disgrace, or its most enduring symbol? By 1972, Elvis Presley was no longer simply a singer. He was a battlefield where America's contradictions collided. Youth and tradition, rebellion and patriotism, glory and scandal. For years, he had endured the same refrain from the same unrelenting voice, the judge who had branded him a disgrace back in 1956. Now, as if determined to end where it began, the man returned once more, his words sharper than ever. At a civic gathering in Memphis that spring, the judge stood before a packed audience. Reporters scribbled furiously as he repeated his charge. Elvis Presley is the worst influence this nation's youth has ever known. He has corrupted morals, cheapened culture, and weakened the spine of America. He is, and always has been, our national disgrace. The applause in that hall was thin, but the words carried weight in print. Newspapers ran them coast to coast, stirring up old arguments. Elvis saw the clippings in his dressing room at Madison Square Garden just weeks later. He was preparing for what would become one of the most important concerts of his life. He sat silently for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. Around him, the usual bustle of makeup artists, wardrobe assistants, and musicians blurred into background noise. He folded the paper neatly, set it aside, and whispered to himself, "They've said it all before. Tonight, I'll give them my answer." The concert hall was electric, the kind of electricity that rattles bones before the first note is played. More than 20,000 people packed the garden, their voices a roar even before the lights dimmed. Outside, vendors sold photographs and souvenirs. Inside, critics sharpened their pens, ready to dissect every gesture. The king stepped onto the stage in his white jumpsuit embroidered with gold, a cape flowing behind him like a banner. The crowd erupted. For an hour, he gave them everything. Proud Mary, Suspicious Minds, Love Me Tender. His voice was strong, his presence magnetic, his energy relentless. But near the end, as the applause thundered, he did something unexpected. He motioned for the band to pause. The room grew still. He held the microphone close, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of years. "I want to say something," he began. "When I was just a boy from Tupelo, they said I was a danger. They called me a disgrace. They said I was sin, a threat to America." His eyes scanned the silent crowd, faces leaning in. "But I never wanted to hurt anybody. All I ever wanted was to sing, to bring people a little joy, a little hope. And if loving music, if loving this country, if giving my heart every night makes me a disgrace, then I'll wear that word proudly for the rest of my days, because I love America, and I love her people." There was a heartbeat of silence, as though the words had stunned the garden into breathlessness. Then the sound came, an eruption so deafening it shook the rafters. People leapt to their feet, clapping, shouting, some with tears streaming down their faces. Cameras flashed, capturing images of fans with hands pressed to their mouths, overcome by emotion. Backstage afterward, his bandmates sat in awed silence. One finally said, "Elvis, I think you just shut them up for good." He only smiled faintly, wiping sweat from his brow, and replied, "I wasn't trying to shut anyone up. I was just telling the truth." The newspapers the next morning bore headlines that seemed to admit defeat. Presley's words shake the garden. The voice of a nation. Columnists who had once called him vulgar now marveled at his sincerity. The judge, contacted by reporters, refused to comment. His silence was more telling than any speech. The crusade he had waged for 16 years had finally collapsed under the weight of Elvis's own testimony. In the months that followed, the moment became legend. Fans retold it in letters, critics quoted it in essays, and even those who had doubted him admitted that something profound had happened that night. Elvis Presley had not only reclaimed his dignity, he had reshaped his legacy. No longer merely the boy who scandalized television or the soldier who carried a guitar into the barracks, he had become a symbol of resilience, of humanity, of the simple but unshakable belief that music could unite where judgment divided. For Elvis, the victory was not about silencing a judge. It was about proving, once and for all, that the boy from Tupelo had never been a disgrace. He had been a mirror, reflecting the fears, the hopes, the contradictions of a nation struggling to define itself. And on that stage in Madison Square Garden, in front of thousands and with millions listening, he claimed his place not as America's shame, but as its voice. The king had spoken his last word on the matter, and this time no one could take it away.